10:50.
Okay. And in case, Hemant, let's assume that we have a good number of questions. We'll go on beyond 12, right? I mean, we can
Yeah,
go a
we
few
can.
minutes.
We can.
We'll go a few minutes beyond.
Correct. Depending on the response and how many questions we have, I think we can always take a call. I mean, the session continues. Session doesn't stop. So yeah, I see participants joining in because I have opened the session.
Yeah. I'm seeing if I recognize people.
Oh, good. You recognize people.
So audio audible already to everyone?
Yes, yes. Audio, video, everything is there for people to see, hear. We can never see or hear them though.
Okay.
So we'll make an announcement. We can make an announcement towards the end. We'll take questions so people can put their questions in their respective Q&A window.
We'll go live at sharp 11, right, Hemant?
Yeah.
I did forward the mail to hundreds of colleagues all over in academic and industry.
Right.
So let's
it's Saturday. It's Saturday morning. So
yeah, 11 is.
Is it usually Saturday mornings?
Yeah.
Right.
So it always varies.
Hemant, do we want to? We'll talk about that offline. Do you want to push that to 5 p.m. or continue?
Awesome. Well, Saturday 5 p.m. might be more difficult for people who knows their. Yeah, we have a few minutes, good 3 minutes at least. So we can chat a little bit with the awareness that people can hear and see us.
Nothing confidential.
Okay.
How big is
Kumar, where are you based out of?
I'm based out of Bangalore.
I see. Yeah, I'm in Pune, and well, Rajiv is in Delhi.
I'm going to eat 1 minute of the time, Kumar, to introduce you. So, and I'll make it a little bit more informal since I know you very well. I'll add that a little bit informality too.
Thank you. It no longer makes any difference where you are.
I know.
Yeah. Since 2020.
So Rajiv, you're at home right now, and what's that poster behind you, the picture?
We have paint. This is my drawing room. I kind of have this bad habit of occupying the entire dining table. That's the Venice. It's a paint.
Yeah,
picture.
I thought so. So this is real Venice, not in Las Vegas, right?
No, this is Venice. This is Venice. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, my study room is a little bit compact. I prefer here. It's much more airy and open here. So, of course, the challenge I have is I occupy the entire dining table, and my wife says, "Listen, the house has become a library." But that's true with all of us.
Actually, when we do this using On24 platform, you can see the affiliation of people, where they are, I mean, whether they are at academic institution or organization. Here in Zoom, you can't see that.
Yeah, I'm unable to see anybody except 3 of us. Yeah.
No, go to attendees tab.
Attendees, yeah.
Okay. There you will see the names of people.
Yes,
you don't see their affiliation. That's the thing.
That's right.
So for the benefit of those who have joined in, we are going to wait another 40-50 seconds, well, until 11 o'clock before we start. This is the first time we're doing this using Zoom webinar. Typically, we do this using On24 platform. It's a proprietary one.
Webinar, that's what we use.
So Rajiv, you will do the housekeeping announcements, right? We will take questions at the end. People can do Q&A in their window. They can log the question anytime.
Yeah, no, I think you can do that, Hemant, after the ACM India overview, then hand it over to me.
Okay, will do. Shall we start?
Yeah, we're all set. Yeah.
Okay, so over to you, Rajiv.
Hello, everyone. A very good morning from New Delhi. Welcome to the ACM India Industry Webinar. We have a very accomplished speaker today. We're really delighted to host Dr. Kumar Sivarajan, who really needs no introduction in the world of communication networks, optical communications. At this point in time, I would like to request my colleague, Dr. Hemant Pandey, who's the ACM India Executive Director, to please share with us the various activities of ACM India, and we'll then introduce the speaker after that. Over to Dr. Hemant Pandey. Thank you.
Sure. Hey, thanks, Rajiv. And hi, Kumar. And also, hello to everybody who's joined in already, and those who are continuing to join in. So, hello, everyone. Welcome to this another one of ACM India Industry Webinar session, where we invite accomplished technologists from Indian industry. They are in Indian industry, but their contribution and their accomplishments there at the world level. So this is an initiative which we've been doing for now over 2 years. Every couple of months we do this, and thanks to support from all the participants, we've been continuing this. Because this is an ACM India's initiative, it behooves us to take a look at what ACM India is all about. And I'm going to take a minute or two only for doing this. And in fact, those who are the usual participants probably know this by heart. They can probably say this better than I do now. But I'll just speak to this one slide about ACM India. It's the world's largest society of computing professionals. And again, professionals include students, academicians, consultants, industry professionals from computing, in the area of computing. And this area of computing is expanding too, with tons of interdisciplinary aspects coming in. You speak of IoT, you speak of networking and things like that. It touches all areas. Everything computing is kind of encompassing everything right now. So having talked about ACM, in India, we have more than 12% of world's membership. So more than 12,000, where the world membership is more than 1 lakh. It's about 1 lakh. And it's growing. So the activities of ACM, which are under the mission of advancing computing, they fall under education, fall under research, fall under contribution, acknowledgement, and providing visibility, and also individual professional development by providing resources, either passive resources or active resources. Passive resources in the sense that making available wealth of knowledge, whether it is through the journals and newsletters, emails that come to the members, or actively organizing things such as this particular webinar, such as the recently concluded boot camp that we had, on various topics. Okay, so talk about education. We organize for students, it would be relevant. We organize winter and summer schools, which have been very, very popular, which is worth one semester course, in fact, because they are full-time 2 weeks, and so on. So as I said, and last but not the least, for empowering women in computing, we have what's called ACMW India. They also organize a number of things or organize activities which include or promote participation and leadership of women in computing. So having said this, all I'm going to say is that do avail of all these things, become a member. The links of membership are they listed there. We will share this with you. Also, simple thing is to simply, you can go to india.acm.org and, excuse me, you will get access to all the wealth of information, schedule of calendar, and also the membership link. So having said this, I'm going to now announce a few things that, as you know, all participants, other than the three of us, we are, all participants are not visible and not audible. But you can communicate with us, especially with Kumar, by putting your questions in the Q&A window at any time. If there is something which is urgent or he feels that it could be a showstopper and he needs to address it, he can probably take it up during the talk. But by and large, we take up questions one by one towards the end. So feel free to put the questions in the Q&A window. Okay. And having said this, I'm going to give right back to Rajiv, who's today's host, and for him to introduce Kumar and take it forward. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Hemant, for the introduction. It's now a great pleasure and a privilege for me to introduce Dr. Kumar Sivarajan. In the world of optical networks and optical communications, I don't think Dr. Kumar Sivarajan needs any introduction, neither in India nor outside India. He's one of the global well-renowned names in the area. It is also indeed an additional pleasure for me to be the host today, because I have known Dr. Sivarajan since I was a PhD student at ISC Bangalore, and it goes back in the early 90s. In fact, I've known him for almost now 30 years, and it's a little bit of nostalgia today that I'm now introducing Dr. Kumar Sivarajan. Dr. Sivarajan is the Chief Technology Officer at Tejas Networks, Bangalore. He has 3 decades of experience in the field of telecommunications. He's a fellow of the Indian National Academy of Engineering. In 2000, Dr. Sivarajan received the Swarna Jayanti Fellowship from the Department of Science and Technology, Government of India. Kumar has co-authored the best-selling book, Optical Networks, A Practical Perspective, which is currently in its 3rd edition. And I can share with all our audience today that is one of the finest books in optical networks we've read. Kumar is also the recipient of the prestigious IEEE WRG Baker Prize Paper Award in 1997, which is presented for the most outstanding paper reporting original work in the transactions, journals, and magazines of the societies or in the proceedings of IEEE. So Kumar Sivarajan was the first chairperson of the governing council of the well-known Telecommunication Standard Development Society of India, which is the TSDSI. Prior to joining Tejas Networks, Dr. Sivarajan was an associate professor at the Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore, and a research staff member at the IBM T.J. Watson Research Center in New York. Dr. Sivarajan holds a BTech in Electrical Engineering from IIT Madras, MS PhD from California Institute of Technology, US. Dr. Sivarajan received the Distinguished Alumnus Award from IIT Madras in 2013. It's again a great pleasure and a privilege, and we all look forward to Dr. Kumar Sivarajan's talk. Over to you, Kumar. Thank you.
Thank you, Rajiv, for the very flattering introduction. I hope my audio is very clear. Yes, okay. Thank you, Hemant, as well, and thank you, ACM. Let me share my slide. Okay. Okay, Rajiv, is my slide clear on full screen?
Yes, very clear, Kumar. Yes.
Okay, good. Okay, thank you all. Thank the audience for joining. As you would have heard from the introduction, I'm an IEEE guy. I know nothing about computing, I've cleverly worded this as advances in communications technology, since that's the only C I can talk about. I know nothing of content and very little of computing. So, I mean, convergence is a big topic. It's been going on for 2-3 decades. It's usually meant convergence of communications and computing. I think today we can add content to it as well. So I'll explain the setup. So what's new? I don't want to talk about COVID. I think we all know COVID is new and we hope it goes away. Okay. I think the new thing in communications is IoT. Now you're already familiar with one form, which is, I think everyone now has a Fitbit or equivalent. You're monitoring your heart rate, the number of steps or whatnot. If you weren't before 2020, COVID forced you. Okay. So IoT is the next big thing. And there's one, let's say, a low bandwidth form, which we're sort of getting to be familiar with, sensors of the kind we know, your Fitbit or smartwatch being one example. But another bigger form of IoT would be self-driving cars, maybe self-driving drones if you're ambitious. These would talk to some gateway and back into the network. And a lot of this is expected to use up computing and content in the cloud. Okay, so this is kind of where we expect to be by 2030. So 2020 is over. ITU works in decades. 2010 they had a goal. Then IMT 2020 was 5G. IMT 2000 I think was 4G, and now they have IMT 2030, which is 6G. And kind of 6G, as we know, 10 years ahead of time, is we largely think self-driving cars, IoT, and various things like that. So let's just review what happened in communications. Long ago, we had black phones, but that's so long ago, nobody remembers. But I do remember I had a black phone when I was a kid. So communications until, let's say, 20 years ago was TDM, voice. Even 10 years ago, it was all megabits in the access. If you're a megabit to your home, you were happy. That's what DSL gave you, then gigabits in the core. We were mostly happy doing email, SMS, and searching the web. So I was using computers way before there was HTTP and web browsing, but most of you are too young to know that. Today, what you're all familiar with is what you're experiencing on this webinar. You're watching video, you do a lot of video streaming. At home, you have 100 meg minimum. You probably have a gig, though you might not be getting a gig. And then in the core, you have terabits, and everything is video. You're watching movies, Netflix, Amazon Prime, and everything is teleconferencing. And if it didn't happen in 2019, it's definitely happened in 2020. So what's the communications in 2030? So the big thing that is expected to be is, many forms of IoT, and I use that term very broadly. Self-driving cars are sort of the best example everyone's shooting for. If you can figure out what the infrastructure is for self-driving cars, cars talking to each other, cars talking to the infrastructure, lampposts on the road, figuring out not to hit anybody or anyone else, no accidents, and if they can drive through, I think we have enough communications for any other form of IoT. So this has sort of become the dominant example. And this kind of stuff requires tens of gigabits in the access. So what you were getting 100 meg to a gig at home will be many gigabits, tens of gigabits to every car, because of the amount of data that needs to be exchanged and sent back and forth. And of course, terabits in the core. Some of the data will be mission critical. People are thinking of remote surgery, haptics. You can operate robots remotely. All of that is happening quite fast, by the way. I was in some rudimentary demonstration where you can move your eyebrows, and a robot halfway around the world will move its eyebrows in exactly the same manner. And all that's coming on much more rapidly than we think. So all this is advancing. So devices, we had smartphones, we had basic phones, this kind like 20 years ago. Today we have smartphones, the latest iPhone or Apple. And there's a lot of processing on this device, much more than we had on our servers, desktops 20 years ago. The future communication devices are going to be, largely around sensors, Internet of Everything. That's supposed to be a picture of an automated factory, robots assembling stuff. I think this will be dominant. It'll be a wide range of, home devices, industrial devices, factories, and we have 6 billion people today, but this thing will be 60 billion or 100 billion users for the communication network. And that's a good thing because we need growth. And communication networks is kind of getting limited by the number of people in the world. So I think having Internet of Things will ensure there are far more users everywhere. So everyone's trying to build, smart homes. Not everyone, at least the uber rich are building smart homes, but we also have some form of it through Alexa and so on. Smart factories, campuses are coming up with private LTE, private 5G. What's happening to data centers? So earlier, a data center was a big, massive thing. You had something in Iceland because that's where electricity was cheap and it was cold and you didn't have to air condition so much. Power was a big issue. And these are all terabit scale data centers. There's even a data center which was buried in the ocean simply because of cooling requirements. So these are very, very large scale power requirements constructed wherever you could get the cheapest power in real estate. Over the last few years, data centers have moved closer to us. Now almost every business park has a data center. I work in Electronic City, Bangalore, and there's a data center there, and so on. So data centers are getting smaller, closer, simply because companies don't want to keep their data on their premises anymore. We don't. What about if there's an accident or something? That's one that used to be the old logic. Now it's more like we don't want to deal with servers. We don't want to buy computers. We just give everybody glorified terminals and they'll send everything to the data center. That apparently lowers the cost. I haven't looked at the economics closely, but it's very convenient anyways. We don't deal with upgrades, new hardware, and so on. Everything goes to the data center. One issue here is latency. So it used to be that when the server was with you, the latency was very, very low. Moving things to the business cloud does make the latency better, but not as low as you would like for things like gaming and so on. So now data centers are moving even closer to the customer premises. People want latencies of a few milliseconds, very important, I suppose. Today for gaming, tomorrow for any kind of remote operation. But remote operation is probably limited by the end-to-end latency. Anyway, there is a need, perceived need to reduce the latency, so data centers are moving closer. Content also needs to move closer, so that's another reason to move these data centers close to you. And the most extreme example would be every cell tower is a data center, because that's the closest place where you touch the infrastructure, and that itself becomes some form of data center with at least computing capability and so on. So how is this changing the communications? So earlier we had, desktop servers, whatever, computers were the users. They were at my desk, and you had content and video and everything else to be fetched remotely, and there was a communication channel that had to be set up, a network. With more things going into the cloud, the computing also went into the cloud, and so I only had a terminal, and communications was fetching me both computing and content. Now with edge data centers and so on, there's computing and content in multiple places, and communications is what connects me. So I don't know much about computing. I know nothing at all about content. So I'll just focus on the communications. So how do we scale the communications to sort of address this new growth, hyper growth in capacity, requirement of very low latency and so on? So latency is a driver because that's sort of what is new. I think bandwidth scaling I will talk about, and there are many ways to scale the total capacity. But latency requires you to think differently. And reliability is becoming far more important. Nobody would ever think that a home broadband connection needed to be extremely reliable. But today, all business leaders are working from their homes. And so the home broadband probably needs to be more reliable than their office broadband. So, for example, the 12 months that I have lived with COVID and communicated a lot from my home, I've had the fiber in my home cut at least 3 times, and I had to rely on a 4G connection. So reliable broadband is becoming important. And security and quality of service are also important. In our company, we worried about security with people working from home, having access to everything, but that's not the sort of security I know much to talk about. But I will talk about QoS and how to assure that. For example, for this call, we're just relying on the internet giving me whatever it can give me, but there are new mechanisms now to ensure I get exactly the quality of service I need. I'll touch upon that as well. So in order to scale the network, so let's describe how the whole network looks like. So you have many end users and systems. So it's no longer just humans, it's cars, it's every kind of sensor. And people have been talking about it for a few years, but I think now we are starting to see a lot of these sensors. So I can see that the number of devices on the 5G network will be an order of magnitude more than on 4G, simply because everyone's going to connect directly. And automation of factories and so on is happening. There is IoT coming in, artificial intelligence, machine learning, all that will. Computing devices have proliferated. I think there's a need, starting with caching your Netflix and Amazon Prime Video, maybe moving on to video surveillance, and so on. So there's a lot of edge computing, at least starting with video processing, that is starting to happen. I think people soon realize that video surveillance is not enough. It's not enough to install video cameras for video surveillance, because what do you do with all that video? So, and bringing it all to some central place serves no purpose, because who's going to sit and look at it? So I think soon after video cameras were installed, people realized the video has to be processed right there. And only if you have something interesting, you can sort of trigger the code. If you think about it, then that makes you think whether the video camera is the best place, the best way to see what's going on. Maybe there are more efficient ways, but anyway, the way to do that is you put video cameras and then process the video. Then for anything which is non-real time, a lot more processing, you can take the stuff to the cloud. So you can read a number plate from your video camera, at the edge. But then if you need to look up the database to say if there's a traffic ticket or something, then you can take that to the cloud. So that's sort of one example. I request, okay, so I request Hemant and Rajiv to monitor the Q&A window. And if there's anything, alert me by audio. Yes,
yeah,
I'm only...
Sure. We'll do that, Kumar.
Okay, so now let's look at, so the network architecture is changing essentially with this introduction of computing at various places, at the cloud and at the edge. And so this is what the network looks like. I'll come down to more familiar territory. How do you scale the capacity? So fiber optics is what I've worked on for a long time. So fiber is going nowhere in all of this revolution. Fiber is getting more and more entrenched. So actually the final future, and I talked about it some time ago, is that you're going to have less and less wireless and more fiber. So with 5G, I think the cell tower is getting to your lamppost. With 4G, it was within sight of you. You could see it a few kilometers away. I think with the 6G, the fiber will be at your home, and any wireless is sort of going to be very limited. So fiber is the best medium. Anyone who needs to communicate from a fixed location, like a building, whether it be a home or anything else, will be doing it through fiber sooner than later. Like you had electricity to every building was the goal throughout the 20th century, and we got it done 100 years after Edison. Fiber to every building will be the goal in the 21st century, and we'll probably get it done by 2050 or something. So fiber, the capacity needs to scale on the fiber. So there's a new technology which is not I think nicely named. It's called Optical Transport Networks, OTN, but it's really a proper noun, not a common noun. And they've introduced a plethora of acronyms, but essentially many ways to communicate at rates of 10 gig and better, going up to 400 gig today, but I think 600 is already there. This will scale up further. So there are a whole bunch of new standards. How do you communicate at different rates, flexible rates, increase your rate, decrease it, and so on, over optical fiber. And they go with different versions of the standard, like you have 2G, 3G, 4G. There's OTN 1.0, which was 10 gig, 2.0, which was 100 gig, 3.0 goes up to 400 gig, but I think there's already 600 gig. One of the advantages of this is very low latency. So what do you mean by low latency? Everything is at the speed of light. Light is 300,000 kilometers per second, but that's on the air. In the fiber, it's only 200,000 kilometers per second. That doesn't matter to most of us, but it does matter to Wall Street. That's a different topic. But here the issue is that if you use packetized forms of communications, you typically have to wait for the whole packet to be received at every node on the way. So that adds latency. Actually, that adds a significant amount of latency. So OTN is designed to just cut through. Only a few bits need to come in and pad it. So the overall latency can be very close to what the speed of light gives you. It also gives you, in some sense, the old-fashioned hard partitioning of resources. Everybody gets their own dedicated bandwidth. This is lease lines at 10 gig to 400 gig, what people like, even in the era of packet networking. So this is the multiplexing standard, if you want. So what's happening at the physical layer? So at the physical layer, how do you? I'm trying to get rid of my black screen, but I can't. That's okay. So 100 to 600 gig is how do you provide communication rates at these 100 to 600 gig? So the fundamental advance, anybody in communications is familiar, is to do multi-level modulation. So traditionally, you use optical networking until like 10 years ago, used binary modulation. So you had laser was on or laser was off. With coherent communications, you came up to QPSK, which means you had a constellation here, which would have one of 4 signals. And then you could decrease that to 8 QAM, one of 8 signals, one of 16 signals, one of 32 signals. So if you could choose one of 32 signals, you have 5 bits per symbol, because that's something you can work it out. So that's one aspect, how many bits do you encode per symbol? The second is how large is the symbol, right? So the symbol can take, you can send 70 gigabaud, which means you send 70 billion signals per second. You could also communicate at 50 gigabaud, 35 gigabaud, and so on. So you could also, that essentially says how much bandwidth you're using for the communication. Roughly speaking, a gigabaud uses a gigahertz. So 50 gigabauds would be 50 gigahertz of bandwidth on the fiber. Fiber is getting limited by bandwidth. So people didn't think this would happen about 20 years ago. But today, the amount of bandwidth you can get on the fiber is roughly about 80 channels of 50 gigahertz. So that's about 4 terahertz. Maybe you can stretch it to 4.5 terahertz. That's the amount of bandwidth that you have on the fiber. So you have to make do with that amount of spectrum, if you will. That's a lot when you compare with RF spectrum, but we are running out of that and having to invent all these different modulation schemes. So at 200 gig, so what is the most commonly used communication today is 200 gigabits per second. You use 35 gigabauds, 35 billion symbols per second, and this is sort of what you would use, 16 QAM modulation scheme. Okay, so that's the most commonly used 200 gig, but you can also vary the rate. So to make things very efficient, so what is the y-axis? So I explained the x-axis, the amount of spectrum to take. On the y-axis, you have the signal-to-noise ratio. So typically, based on distance and amplifiers and everything, you would have a signal-to-noise ratio. So let's say that you have a signal-to-noise ratio of 10 dB, which roughly corresponds to 1,000 kilometers. So now do you send 3 bits per symbol or 4 bits? You really want to send 3.5 because you want to use it all up efficiently. So today we have devised communication schemes where every alternate symbol can be either from this constellation with 3 bits per symbol or 4 bits per symbol. So you have a way to get 3.5 bits per symbol. So, and you can do this 3.5 bits per symbol, and you can do this more or less continuously. So you can be very greedy, and depending on the signal to noise ratio you have, which is the distance you want to go over and the noise figure and how good the fiber is, how good the amplifiers are, you could more or less communicate at any rate between depending on the amount of spectrum you take up on the fiber. If you want to communicate at 200 gig, but you can take up different amounts of spectrum on the fiber for the same 200 gig. You can also communicate at 100 gig if you want, which is typically you'd use that today if you want to go further. So you could go to more than 5,000 kilometers at 100 gigabits per second, which you cannot do with 200 gigabits per second. If you don't have to go so far, you can also do 300 gig, 400 gig, 500 gig, or even 600 gig. Right? So for 600 gig, you're kind of limited to about 20, 30 kilometers, very popular in the metro space. Okay, and for some reason you want to do 150 gig, 550 gig, that's also available. So optical communication has come a long way. You can pack the capacity based on the distance you need to go, on how good your channel is. The channel is the fiber in this case, how much spectrum you have. And today, I would say the complexity of communication on the fiber in terms of just processing, modulation, coding, and so on, rivals that what happens in the RF space, even though the fiber is such a clean channel. Okay, so I talked about all of this. About 11:30, so I'll try to end in about 15 minutes. So we talked about scaling the bandwidth. How do you scale the latency? So sort of how do you reduce the latency? So you reduce latency. The problem that causes latency is everything having to go to the cloud. So the cloud is centralized, it's far away, and going to the cloud and coming back takes time. So the mantra for reducing latency is that you put computing at the edge. So you have real-time applications which are processed at the edge of your network, and the edge could be your base station, the tower that you see, and non-real-time stuff goes to the cloud. A simple example could be your number plate is read right away at the edge. There's no need to send the number plate, read video or picture to a cloud to process it. It can be done at the edge. But if they want to figure out whether you have any pending traffic challans, then that can go to the cloud. This is a big deal today. I now see overwhelming enthusiasm on the part of the police to tag traffic violations. I had never seen this kind of enthusiasm before. I think this can lead to automated stuff. If you have an accident, then the computing resources at the edge can take care of communicating to the nearest police station, calling your ambulance, and so on. And then if they want to store all the video and analyze who's at fault, that can go back to the cloud. So this kind of stuff is starting to come up. Okay. I'll now talk about reliability. That will be almost my last but one topic. So communication needs to be made reliable. So reliability was usually something that was addressed only in the optical, in the core, never at the edge. So nobody ever worried that the fiber to your home could be cut. Okay, so in the old days, you had one copper pair to your home. There was no protection, there's no ring or anything like that. The same thing continued with fiber. But today, this has become a big area of concern because everybody is working from homes. So they need to make the home broadband also protected and reliable. And I'll talk a little bit about what's happening in that space. Wireless, of course, inherently reliable in the sense there's no fiber to get cut, but also you are dependent on one tower, but you could hand off to the next tower. So there are certain advantages, but you could lose connectivity, and this happens to us a lot. We all are used to saying no signal during a call, and the call drops. So it would be nice if you could connect to two wireless networks at the same time, just like you think of doing in your office. Your office probably has two connections, one going east, one going west, or at least protection. So dual connectivity is coming up with wireless. So those of you who are techies, probably everyone in this audience who use your phone, you will see that you could never use the Wi-Fi and the 4G network at the same time. If you connect to Wi-Fi, then the 4G data goes away. And then if you walk around at home and you're not placed with Wi-Fi, you lose your Wi-Fi signal. Your phone goes around connecting to the 4G network, and that takes time, which means you missed a few precious words of what I'm saying if you're doing that right now. So it'd be nice if your phone could stay connected to both the Wi-Fi and the 4G network. And in future with 5G, 5G is sort of like a carrier's Wi-Fi. So what they'll do is you'll still have your 4G network. They're just going to put 5G hotspots close to your home. So they will put it on the lamppost, outside on the street, and so on. So you get a lot more capacity if you're connected to that. So in some sense, you can think 5G is the service provider's Wi-Fi. And the same way you want to be connected both to the 5G and the 4G. So this is coming up now. It's called dual connectivity, ENDC. So UU-TRAN, new radio dual connectivity. If you want that, new radio means 5G. EU-TRAN is geek for 4G. So this means connected to 4G and 5G at the same time. The same thing you can use for Wi-Fi. Satellites. So there are lots of places with no coverage, rural places, Mount Everest, Sahara Desert. And if you are doing hiking on the weekend, you're sick of working from home, then you're going there and you want to really have coverage all the time. Right? You want to get away from the city, but you don't want to get away from the network. So satellite networks are coming up. Elon Musk wants to do it. Everybody wants to build satellite networks. And the goal is, maybe you can do this far better than base stations on the ground. So let me first tell you that the overall capacity is not going to scale. Even if you put a few thousand satellites and give it all the spectrum that they can use, it's never going to rival the capacity you can get from a terrestrial network, even a wireless network. But satellite's a good way to get coverage. So you can do low Earth satellites. So you need lots of satellites, and they'll keep moving because the satellites cannot stay in one place. There's no way to keep satellite up in one place, except if it's geostationary. But geostationary is the last one. So that means it's very far away. It's 40,000 kilometers away. And then one satellite can cover a half or maybe a third of the Earth. But it will provide very little capacity. The low Earth orbit satellites provide a much more capacity, nothing rivaling your terrestrial base stations. But you need a lot of them because each one covers only a small area, and also they keep moving. By the way, there is an effort in so one question I do get asked is, how do you think of this network and the 5G network? Is satellite going to obsolete 5G? No, in fact, think of these as extra base stations. You could probably, when everything is worked out, roam from your 5G network into the satellite network. So you don't even have to change your service provider or get a different satellite phone or anything. If your phone is capable of talking to the satellite, which will happen 2-3 years down the line, think of this as roaming into another network. So it's going to be seamless so that they can charge you whenever you use the satellite. It may cost you more, but they'll let you roam. Okay. So there are 4 aspects of reliability and that I want to talk about. So one is, how do you provide 50 millisecond protection for home broadband connections? Second is, how do you scale capacity at the core without sort of duplicating everything? So that's the part of reliability in the core network. The other problem, I was in a webinar 2-3 days ago. I was not the speaker. Speaker was a very big man, head of a very large company, but he also had problems. His video was not coming. He was asking, how can it be? I'm in my office, which has such good connectivity, but he had to go, log off, log back in, and so on. So these things happen. So there are now new standards in ITU to check the performance of your connection in all ways that you would like. I'll talk about that as well. And then lastly, Probably all of you are configuring your home broadband routers. You have to log in, you have to do 192.168.1.1. If you know what that is, good for you, but we're trying to make that obsolete so that everything can be remotely configured. Really speaking, we want modern communications, but we want black phone-like behavior. All you need to do is plug it in to that socket, which anybody can do, and then everything should work and be configured remotely through software. And that's where we're trying to move. So that will make everything reliable because you don't have to call anybody. Nothing is there to go wrong. So I'll talk about all these four in one slide each, and then I'll try to end. Okay, so protecting connections. So with GPON, XPON is because it can be GPON, XGS-PON, some form of PON. PON is passive optical fiber network, broadband network at home. So there are protection schemes. There have traditionally been protection schemes in the carrier network that's been extended now for Ethernet and MPLS, both line protection and ring protection. The R is ring or shared protection, the L is for line protection. So I'll not talk about the last two. This is well established, but let's talk about how to protect your home broadband network. So this is your home broadband. You're sitting in this flat. You have an ONT, which is the box your service provider gave you, which terminates the fiber. And back in the exchange, there's an OLT. So one way is that the service provider puts in another OLT, gives you another fiber that comes into your home, and you get an ONT with two fibers, which you can connect. So this is called Type C protection, and it's starting to come up. And for those of us who are willing to pay that extra, which may be like 2x, you will get, you can ask, why not have two connections? But then if you have two connections, the burden of switching is on you. Whereas here, if you pay for two connections, the burden of switching is on the service provider. So this is Type C protection. But it's very hard to get another fiber to your home. Your apartment owners association may object. So it's easier to get a fiber just to the building, to the streets, to the side cabinet owned by the service provider. So it doesn't have to deal with the home stuff. This is Type B protection. It doesn't protect that last few hundred meters, but it's good enough, and it's probably what's going to get deployed. So soon your service provider will tell you, hey, I'll give you an option to protect, and then just pay me 50% extra to protect up to the curb and double to protect all the way to your home, and you can decide if you want that. Internally in his own network, everything needs to get protected, but traditionally protection meant that you have path one going to the destination, and path two takes you to the same destination. But today the destination is the internet, so there's no need to go back to the one specific router. All you need to do is have another way to the internet. So the better form of protection is that normally traffic goes on path one to internet gateway one, but there is a fiber cut, you go on path two to internet gateway two, whatever was the internet gateway on the other side. We've actually implemented a very large network across 4,800 railway stations in India, where we use this form of protection. So you either go to the internet gateway, which is 50 kilometers on the east, or to the internet gateway, which is 50 kilometers on the west, if the fiber is cut. So this is a more sensible form of protection. And this can happen in 50 milliseconds and so on. So that we do. How do you make the equipment scale and also be reliable? So traditionally, the idea was that you duplicate everything. So if you have a switching fabric, which was switching at a terabit per second, you would have a second switching fabric at another terabit per second. So if one goes down, you have the other one. But this gets expensive to do at like 48 terabits per second. So that's one problem. The second problem is that you are traditionally used to buying one big shelf of equipment and then populating it as you go along. So you decide a priori that you want 1 terabit, so you buy a switch for 1 terabit, and then you add line cards. So that is changing. It's changing in two ways. One is the fabric and the separated, and they're cabled up. So this means you can have completely new interfaces tomorrow, or completely new fabric which you never thought of. You're not limited by the shelf and the backplane that you could build on day one. So disaggregate and interconnect with cables or fiber is a better way to build even equipment for scaling. Second, once you build it this way, I don't have to duplicate, let's say, the switching fabric. So I can have here, each of these fabrics working at 8 terabits per second, and I can have one fabric protecting 3. So I have 24 terabits here as opposed to 16 because I do 1:n protection for the switching fabric. That's the second innovation in building reliable equipment. You protect end-to-one, and then you separate the interfaces from the fabric. So very large, routers, switches, optical transmission equipment is being built in this way today. Then the next one is quality of service. Okay, so we are going through the internet through a packet network. There's no dedicated capacity. It's not a lease line. So we need to make sure that the connection is fine. So the initial attempt at this was a standard in ITU called Y.1731. ITU always has these numbers, no names for the standard. So this made sure that your throughput was okay, your latency was okay. That's called a frame delay. You're not losing packets, so there's a frame loss. And frame delay variation is jitter. So because the delay is just the average could be good, but you really don't want anything going off by more than 20 milliseconds if you're doing voice or real-time video. So these SLAs would be reported. They would say, okay, I'm setting up a connection, check all this, and then you start. Or it could actually happen continuously. It was non-intrusive. So continually you get a report. Your service, if you get bandwidth from a service provider, you probably want to ask him, how do I know I'm getting all this? So he'll say, sir, here for the last 1 month is your data for throughput, delay variation, and you are getting what you paid for. But that still means that your CEO's talk in the all hands was not audible to a lot of people. So people are starting to ask such questions on service assurance. So there's a new standard, Y.1564, which is the service activation or assurance test. So it's intrusive, which means that you're really simulating traffic the way that a video conference or something which would do, or even in a much more rigorous fashion. So you first start by running a short low bandwidth test, then you keep generating more and more traffic and see what happens to all the frames. You look at latency, loss, jitter, you look round trip performance, one way, every possible performance impairment that you can get. And then you check it all out, and then you hand it to your CEO for his talk to Wall Street. So this is a new standard that allows you to measure and diagnose the exact performance of a call that would happen with all possible traffic. So that's the thing. Lastly, I said we need to make everything reliable, like your black phone. So you really want the hardware to do very little. So there's few things that you cannot get away with. So you need to run the MAC and the PHY. So if you're doing GPON, somebody has to do the physical layer protocol and the MAC protocol, which means you need to schedule different homes. But everything else is software configurable. So everything else is configured remotely, and therefore you can change, you can upgrade. And so that's where we are heading. Make the end equipment extremely simple, no configuration, really no processing, just the physical layer and the MAC layer, which is unavoidable. Everything else is configured from remotely. Okay. And my last topic, which I have about 3 minutes, is how to. People are familiar, especially in communications, with quality of service and VPN and so on. But that only was through one technology. So you built a VPN across routers. So today the whole goal is end-to-end, and what you were thinking of as a virtual lease line is now called a network slice. So the network slice starts at the edge of the network. With wireless, it's 4G or 5G. With PON, it's your home. It goes through your access, edge, and core cloud. It may go through very large disaggregated switches, terabit switches in the network infrastructure, and end up somewhere in the core network in some cloud. So all of this slice will go through this entire end-to-end network infrastructure, which goes to computing and communication. So earlier, when you thought of VPN or a virtual lease line or a virtual private line in ATM or something, or MPLS, it was only communications. Today, you also have to, you also need computing resources. So really speaking, so the network will get sliced. The term became popular with 5G, but what it is really a virtual private connection for you, which is end-to-end and goes through the communications infrastructure and the compute infrastructure. The most basic slice will be the internet slice. So people want basic internet. So the internet that you're thinking of will just be a slice on the new communication infrastructure that is being built on. There will be other slices for very specialized applications. There will be a low latency slice for all the gaming users or the remote surgeons, the remote factory operators, whatever. So there will be a low latency slice. There will be an enhanced broadband slice for people wanting to do video conference all day from their homes and be assured of bandwidth, latency, and so on, and simulate an in-person environment. There will be an IoT slice, which is far more demanding for self-driving cars. And all of these slices, including the basic internet slice, will get built on the same infrastructure. And it will be end-to-end. So it will go from the edge of the network to the core and back to the edge on the other side. It has to go through multiple operators. It's very similar like a phone call. Long ago, when you made a phone call, it had to go through multiple operators and the connection had to be set up. We don't think about it. Even now, today, it is like that. But a slice will essentially be an end-to-end connection. And it will have dedicated resources, not only communications or bandwidth, but also computing, storage, and so on. And it will be isolated from other slices. That's the behavior that the user is demanding. That think of it as nothing should happen to the slice, regardless of anything else in the network. So it should be a virtually private network. So let me end with so this is just the thing that the slice now is both a virtual network and a virtual machine. And it's a virtual network which is end-to-end, not just routers and switches, but also your base stations and OLTs, that is wireless and wired access network, core of the network through WDM and ROADM. It's also a virtual machine. You get computing, you get storage. So a slice is all of this. Let me give you an example. I go to Chennai, which is nearby. Occasionally, my in-laws live there. So if I were to go there in 2030, and I don't want to drive my car, hopefully someone like Google offers a self-driving service, and I have a Tesla. I don't, but I wish I had. But if I did in 2030, this Tesla would drive itself, but it needs a network to provide it a slice, because it has to communicate with other cars, the infrastructure, and so on to drive from here to Chennai. And it also has to switch service providers. So this V2X slice that it gets from the network in Karnataka also has to roam into a V2X slice that it gets in Tamil Nadu. And on the way, well, we don't use gas anymore in 2030 or petrol or diesel. So it needs to get charged. So once the charge goes down, the car will drive itself to the nearest charging station and charge there. So this also is integrated into my network slice. And on the way, my headlamp stops working. There's a Bosch service center. You can see I stole this slide from some Bosch presentation. So the car will drive itself to the Bosch service station and get the headlamp replaced by some robot there. And so you need to integrate my V2X slice with the industrial IoT slice with Bosch. And so all of this is the way we will travel to Chennai in 2030. Okay. Lastly, so you have an internet slice, which everyone else is using, and I have an IoT slice on which I'm using my self-driving car. I must have a better slice because my Tesla needs a much better behavior than the internet for the common man. So that means the net neutrality and everything else that many of us care about will die if it is not already dead, because the internet is now, you will get from what you call as the internet, the behavior that you pay for, the bandwidth, latency, performance that you pay for. The basic internet will continue for basic usage, but the rest of the network infrastructure, which is being built at a lot of cost by service providers, will become dedicated connections for dedicated purposes. That's the end of my talk. Here's a plug for my company. So Tejas makes all the equipment that you see on this picture, from GPON to optical transmission to all the core switches that I talked about. We spend a lot of money on R&D, and we have a lot of people. If you're interested in working for Tejas, send me a mail. I'll stop here and I'll take questions. Thank you. See, this is my email. I'll leave this slide just for you to study. I take questions. Nanda Kumar. So I have 3 questions. All the scaling up, do they have any impact on the environment? Okay, that's a very tough question. So, well, let's see, what are the impacts that you have on the environment? So power and green is one big question. Data centers do guzzle a lot of power. Okay? And so the whole mobile network consumes a lot of power, in the sense it's not very green. We are all used to having to charge our phone and having chargers now everywhere in the car and home. You're always plugged in, even though it's supposed to be wireless. But actually, far more power is consumed by the network infrastructure, by the base stations, probably 10x or even more than all your cell phones combined. So the cellular infrastructure consumes a lot of power. It's way more than 2G. In fact, 4G consumes a lot more power than 2G, simply because it's linearity. The 4G waveform is not very linear. There's a lot of high peak to average variation. So the power amplifiers and everything consume way more power than 2G. So people are starting to think about it in 5G, but there are no good solutions, because 5G is essentially 4G. So you can turn off radio, you can turn off the power, but calling that there are no good solutions. Yes, Rajiv, somebody has a question? No? Okay. So that's Nanda Kumar's question. I've answered it live. The next question is from Joy Puri. One hears about information-centric networking. Do you see this as the next big thing in network? Any thoughts on how that would influence carrier networks? Well, I don't know. I've not thought about this much. But what I can say is the networks of tomorrow are not interconnecting us. They're interconnecting computers and devices and sensors and so on. So maybe that's what they mean by information centric. And that's true. So the next generation of networks 10 years hence is being designed to be essentially device centric or IoT centric and not human centric. It's kind of what happened in the last 20 years. Networks used to be voice centric. Now they're all data centric. Your voice is just an app you use on WhatsApp or something else. And I think the next network is going to be device centric, is going to be designed for machines, and we humans will be a small number of users of that network. So take that as done. Nanda Kumar, connectivity over oceans. What about connectivity over oceans? Oceans connectivity is actually scaling quite well. More fiber is being laid across all the oceans. Capacity is scaling up. You already used to be in terabits. It's now even more terabits. But it's not going to petabits or whatever, because it's hard to do with the same fiber. So it's really more fibers being laid to sort of multiply capacity across the oceans. It turns out that we had a lot of capacity across the oceans even 10 years ago. The issue was filling it all up. So we had very little capacity to our homes. And I think the last 5 to 10 years has been spent in getting more capacity to the edge of the network to users to fill up all the oceans. So now the oceans are starting to get upgraded, but there's no easy way to upgrade other than just adding more fiber, which is sort of a linear scaling, but that's starting to happen. Then the next question is from Ramki. And I know I wanted somebody to stand up, to wake up. I said net neutrality is dead. So Ramki asks, net neutrality is dead, why should it be? Maybe for a period, need not be in the stable state of innovation. If standards bodies do their homework and regulation steps in. So I think I deliberately put this in just to wake people up and start them thinking on all these difficult issues. I think the net in some form will continue as the internet, what we call, that will be called the internet, and that will continue to be neutral. So there is a third class cabin, which old people like Ramki and I understand, there's first class, second class, and third class. So if there's a third class, which is the internet, which will continue, it will be neutral and so on, it's unreserved. But then there will be first class cabins, which are all reserved for I2, V2X slices or whatever else that people want to pay for. So the telecom service provider will provide a basic internet, which will be neutral, on which you can make calls and get best of service, but they'll also sell off dedicated slices of their network for specific applications. It won't be called internet if there's a net neutrality law, but that is what it takes to create a dedicated infrastructure. I have no more open questions, and I have 2 minutes left, so I'll hand it over to Rajiv.
We have a couple of questions from us, hosts, Kumar. Correct. So, Hemant, yes. You want to go ahead first? I have a couple of questions too, I think.
Okay. Now, a quick question I have, Kumar, is that take example of my broadband. Okay, I just renewed my service, and what they used to offer for the same kind of cost, about 300 or 350 gigs per month. Now for the same rate, they're offering me 3.5 terabytes per month. Okay.
Right.
So what is making this possible? In computing, we talk about this Moore's law where things double every 18 months, but this is much faster than that. So in one question is, how is that becoming suddenly affordable, providing this kind of data? The second thing is that this new thing that I see on my phone, which is voice over Wi-Fi. Okay. All I have to do is to enable. Again, it's service free, recently added by Airtel and VI, Vodafone India, and so on. So those are the two questions I have.
I'll answer those two, then I have two more questions from Ramki and Kriti Ramamritam. I'll take that. So to answer to your question is, so first they're getting used to paying and metering your service, even though they're giving you 3.5 terabytes. So by the way, I had 250 GB at home when COVID started. In the month of April, I ran out of 250 GB, which I'd never run out over 5 years. So I immediately upgraded to 2 terabytes. They gave it to me for marginally or the same cost. But now my stuff is metered. And in future, when I consume more, they can charge me more. So there is enough capacity now to give you that. Plus, they're not really assuring it to you. So your 2 terabytes will get consumed by your daughter when she's watching movies in the night. When you want this video conference, you'll still get a 3 megabits per second connection. So
yeah, so they call it the FUP, right? Fair usage policy or some such thing.
Yeah. So the second question was voice over Wi-Fi. That actually benefits the service provider. Now he does not have to provide coverage at your home. You cannot say, I don't have coverage in my home, I have to go near the window, please, add a cell tower, none of that stuff. It's a use your Wi-Fi. So you're using your Wi-Fi, which you pay for separately, it may be negligible, but then you are solving his problem of providing coverage at your home. So it actually benefits him. Okay. Let me answer the Ramki's question. First class also gains from net neutrality. Yes, Ramki, is a very big debate. So I don't have an answer. I just wanted to get everybody worked up. Kriti Ramamritam's question, I'm very glad Professor Ramamritam was able to join. How does one verify that slices with different requirements, properties can coexist correctly? Okay, so this is actually a big problem for the service provider. So you have to have, for each slice, you need to reserve network resources, processing resources, queuing resources, and you need to guarantee the slice performance through your network. So which means reserving capacity, reserving buffers, queuing policies. So a slice now needs to be treated like a flow with guaranteed resources everywhere in the network. And that is a problem that takes a lot of sophistication within the equipment and within the network, but is probably hidden from the user. And verify, yeah, so to verify, I think there was a part of the talk, I forget the name, there was a standard, there's a new ITU standard called Y dot something, the successor to Y dot 1731, I think, I always forget the name, it's Y dot 1564. So this you can verify the slice performance. It's an intrusive test, but it's really extensive. You can pump in all kinds of traffic, ramp up, bursty traffic, and then verify that you really get the delay variation that you were paying for. I hope I answered the question. Okay. Yes. So I think we're at the end, Rajiv and Hemant.
So Kumar, a great talk. A couple of quick questions my side. So any thoughts on the potential, as OTNs are evolving and they're getting more and more complex, right? I mean, of course, there's capacity in one dimension, but in every other sense, they're getting more and more complex. Any thoughts on the potential vulnerabilities in the OTN from the point of view of cybersecurity? Do you see that the boxes have vulnerabilities, not the pipes, but the boxes per se?
Oh, you're talking about OTN in particular?
Yes.
Okay, so, well, these optical technologies tend to be more secure than a packet because, it's really set up by the service provider, users don't have any access to it and so on. So that's inherently better, but having said that, yeah, that is one reasonable answer. Having said that, finally, you have to trust equipment makers. Right. So if you can't trust them, they can do anything. They can, at the minimum, they can shut down their boxes if they want to. It's quite easy to do. They can eavesdrop, they can shut down stuff. All that is possible as an equipment maker.
Of course, it's a much better world than the wireless world in terms of cybersecurity. How are the switches evolving, Kumar? I mean, where do you see the complexity of the switches? I mean, as you move on to the terahertz regime, any thoughts on how are the internals of switches evolving? Is there any fundamental difference, or it's basically the same fundamentals?
No, I don't. So I don't think in the hardware world, electronics world, you have an alternative silicon. In the optical world, you have new material, gallium nitride, this and that. So you still, silicon is getting better, switching fabrics are getting better. You're going down to a few nanometers, 5, 6 nanometers or whatever. So silicon is still scaling. Well, not as much as bandwidth. Bandwidth doubles every 12 months, I think, and the computing capacity doubles every 18 months, so the more strong. So bandwidth scaling is better. But fundamentally, that's what's happening. So interconnections are happening with fiber, that helps. And you get distributed fabrics, which scale much better, because when you have the redundancy requirement, then sort of 1:1. And then you separate the interfaces from the fabric. So very large switches are built with this kind of a disaggregated architecture where the fabric is separated, the interface is separated, and they are interconnected by cable.
And one last question, Kumar. The transport is the same. It's legacy TCP, or there's any other transport? It's primarily TCP end-to-end?
Yeah, TCP for non-real-time traffic and UDP for real-time traffic. I don't think the internet protocols are changing, though I'm not an expert on that layer.
Okay, great.
I think it's still
great. Thanks. Thanks so much, Kumar. Do we have any other questions? I don't think there's any other question we have. So I think we are done. I think at this point in time, if there are no other questions, Hemant, I will thank the speaker. Are there any other quick questions from anyone? Okay. So it's 12:05. At this point in time, it's a great pleasure again, Kumar, to have you in this ACM India industry webinar. We conduct these webinars once every 2 months, and we do invite outstanding distinguished speakers from India and abroad. I think great talk, very insightful, where you not only covered the breadth but depth and future. Going forward, I think there's some great stuff going on in optical networks, which I think I really liked your interesting thoughts on net neutrality and on many other things that triggered a lot of discussion going forward. For those who have any additional questions, feel free to write to Dr. Kumar Sivarajan. We'll be happy to share the email ID. So with that, we'll again like to thank you on behalf of ACM India. And I'm going to hand over to Dr. Hemant Pandey. Hemant, over to you.
No, I think just again, I would just like to repeat our gratitude for Kumar for coming, joining us and giving a wonderful talk, and also thank the participants. Thanks to Rajiv also for hosting the show. I think wishing everybody a wonderful weekend. Thanks, and see you in a couple of months. Signing off now.
Thank you once again. Thanks, Kumar. See you in 2 months from now. Yeah, thanks again. We'll sign off.